only true patriotism comes slowly, and it springs from the heart. It is founded upon respect for the family, love for the soil. Premature liberty, then, would have been a disaster for Rome. We would have been torn to pieces by petty squabbles before we had ever reached political maturity, which, as things were, are made as possible by the long, quiet years under monarchy, monarchical government. For it was that the government which, as it were, nursed our strength and enabled us, ultimately, to produce sound fruit from liberty as only a political adult nation can. So wrote the Roman historian Livy. His massive work on the early histories of Rome is taken from book 2, as he discusses the Roman revolution toward liberty and the transition that Rome made when it became a republic. What is a republic? We haven't talked about that yet. Several of you noticed it was the title of Plato's book, quite true. And we'll talk about where that word comes from. It has an important meaning, and it's a Romanized translation of Plato's original book, which you might remember from philosophy class, was the polity. It just meant the city. It gets translated as a republic. But no, republic is a Roman word. It's a Latin word. Res publica, the thing of the people, is what it means. What is that? And what does the Republic have to teach us? The Roman Republic, when it comes to democratic theory and when it comes to self-government and responsible. So what about Roman political thought and its legacy for the way we think about politics and the way we do politics? Well, probably its most obvious contribution is our language. We've got a lot of Latin words that we use all the time. For a variety of things. Certainly the scientific names of animals you've probably seen, lots of descriptions in psychology, and it's all over the place. But when it comes to politics, there's plenty of that too. E pluribus unum, we all know that. From many, one, often used to describe the American Union under the Constitution. And we'll talk about that later. Dictator. Remember, tyrant is a Greek word. The Greeks gave us that one, along with politics and political things. That word polis is the root word of all those. But yeah, the Romans referred to a tyrant. They knew what a tyrant was, and they used the Greek word, but a dictator was different. What's different about a dictator? Well, a dictator in the Roman political system was a perfectly legitimate office. It was a temporary emergency office. We'll talk about how that fits in the Roman Constitution here in a minute, and we'll see what, as we talk about Polybius. Senator, that's obvious. We have the US Senate. We use that very Roman word in our political system. Congregation, or I should say congregatio, sorry, but that's where we get the word Congress. It's like it means to draw together, pull together a collection of people. We often describe a church as a congregation today. This one's really important. Officium, that's the word for duty or obligation. We say office, and we think the place where I go to work. The place where I'm sitting right now as I record this class is my office. But no, officium really meant duty or obligation. It wasn't a physical space. It was like a role that you played. A very unique idea that the Greeks never really developed quite the way the Romans did. Jus or justia or justus, justice. And the root word of that is really fascinating. Jus was the Roman word for Zeus, the god. Remember the god with the lightning bolt, the Olympian? They couldn't say Z. They had no Z pronunciation. And so they called him Jus. But because he's a god of putting things in right order, that's a fitting name for him. And he's sort of the root word of the word justice, as we mean it today. So too, legere. So too, I didn't put it here. That's okay. Oh, it's down below. Yeah, we'll get back to it. Yeah, legere means law. Think legal. And things like that. And what else? The veto means I forbid. If you've studied Latin, you know the verb. If it's you who does it, you put an O at the end. Veto is I forbid. That's veto. And in the Roman political system, anybody could veto anybody. Of course, our system is different. Only the president can veto under the Constitution. But it's interesting to think that the Romans were set up in such a way that anyone could veto whoever. And then you have some other words that are related to politics, but more related to character and public life. Fides, you know what that is. Faith, trust. Semper Fi, right? The Marine Corps. Pietas, a sense of holiness and reverence, mostly for religion. Romans took religion intensely seriously, but also for the ancestors, also for holy things and holy spaces. That's a really important concept. It's hard for us to get because, of course, we live in a democratic society, much as Plato described last time, that we tend to not have much of a sense for veneration for things, the way that a Roman society did. We'll think about that more as we move along. Gravitas, your seriousness, your worthiness. Auctoritas, authority, which didn't necessarily derive from officium, from office. You could have auctoritas, authority, just by your personality. Very often, the greatest heroes of Roman history were just ordinary people who didn't have public office, who had no reputation, who just stepped up and did amazing things all on their own. Relegare. We saw legare up top. We get the word law. The word in Latin literally meant to bind, which is pretty much what law does, right? It prohibits things. Relegare means to bind to the past. That's where we get the word religion. That's what religion actually means. There's some dispute about the origin of the word. It might have been to read again, and it might have been to bind again. St. Augustine hashes out the difference, and he says it's a combination of the two. But yeah, that's the word religion. It just means to worship and to think about sacred things the way our ancestors did, following traditio, tradition, shared memory, spanning across generations. Consider all the wisdom you might gain if you live to be, say, 100 years old. That's pretty impressive. But imagine if you inherited the wisdom from past generations, going way, 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 way back. Wow, that's useful, isn't it? That would be great to have. Traditio gives it to you, the way of the ancestors, the way of those who came before us. So, general sense of Roman history, and this isn't a history class, so don't worry, but just give us a framework. You start with a monarchy in Rome. Sometime around 753 BC to about 509, we go through a series of 7 kings of Rome. Rome was originally governed by a monarchy. And you saw Livy mention that in that opening quote. The fact that with Rome, we start with a series of kings, and each one makes a very important contribution to the way Rome works and the way it understands itself. And each one, whether they knew it or not, was shaping Rome into a free, self-governing republic. The revolution occurred in 509 BC, and it lasted all the way up until 27 BC. And that was the self-governing Roman Republic, which gives us a really remarkable system of government that developed across decades and generations. And it was rough going for the Romans. It was very, very hard. But by the time it was complete, it was quite impressive. But as we know, Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon. He's later assassinated, and then Mark Antony fights it out with Caesar Augustus. Augustus emerges victorious after the Battle of Actium, and then we enter the imperial phase, the empire, which goes from 27, birth of Christ, year 0, up to 476 AD. What's amazing is Romans never really acknowledged that the republic ceased to exist, even though it was kind of displaced by the empire. Well, what's the emperor? A king? No, said the Romans. He's just an emperor. Well, what's the difference between a king and a monarchy, or a Caesar and a monarchy, I should say? Well, they're just different because they're just different. They always believed that the republic endured, even when it was pretty obvious that it didn't. So what happened at the beginning? Well, you had a series of kings, and the last one was Tarquinius Superbus, in Latin, Tarquin the Proud. And Tarquin had a bratty son who just thought he could do anything to the Roman people. Little did they know that the Romans had slowly but surely developed a sense of freedom, going all the way back to Romulus, their founder, all the way up until the end of the monarchy. But the monarchy was just no longer a fit for the Romans because they had become a free people. The origins, though, like we said, go all the way back to Romulus and Remus, the two twin brothers, you might recall, who claimed to be the sons of Mars, the god of war, got into a fight over who should be the founder of the city, and Romulus killed Remus and named the city after himself. So yeah, the monarchy was a violent, bloody kind of institution in Rome, and yet, in spite of themselves, these kings, from Romulus all the way up to Tarquin, Romulus at the beginning and Tarquin at the end, were, like we said, shaping it more and more into a republic. It was finally in 509 BC that Lucius Junius Brutus founded the Roman Republic by overthrowing the monarchy and banishing Tarquin and making all Romans swear an oath before the gods to never have monarchy in Rome again. So that's why, when the emperors came on the scene, the Romans did not believe, right, that they were actually living under a monarchy. So that's the beginning. And the history of Rome is long and complicated, and we won't go into detail here because this isn't a history class, much as I love it. But the common theme throughout is back to traditio. It's the way of the ancestors. It's literally what it meant for them. It was a framework for life that had worked. And it worked because it had been tested by the experience of generations. Each new generation looking back to the wisdom of the one that came before, and the one that came before that, and the one that came before that. It was expressed in maxims and customs and sacred duties and understanding of office, and of course, to religion. What that meant was that the Romans had a deep suspicion of new things. Now, there's nothing wrong with new things so long as they are rooted in the old things. Sure, and the Romans could be very pragmatic when it came to that. Very unlike the Greeks. The Greeks could actually be surprisingly close-minded about new things, and new things often did result in great dangers for them. That was really Plato's criticism of democracy, like we saw. No, the Romans were fine with new things so long as they built on the old things. It's like growing a tree. How about a new branch growing out? Sure, so long as it's attached to the trunk. That's the idea. It's an organic kind of society. The great achievement of the Romans, though, was looking back on the Greeks and seeing that there was always that class tension between the upper crust, the aristocracy who were the privileged and the powerful on one hand, and the lower class on the other. Well, Romans worked out something quite remarkable. The patricians, as they were called, were the aristocracy, the patres, the fathers. We get our word father. The plebeians were the common folk. And what were they like? These two classes that were normally ready to tear each other apart worked out a deal in Rome. And the deal was pretty simple, and it had to do with the conduct that they showed toward each other. Patricians, always surrounded by the statues of their ancestors. You see these carvings of famous patricians holding the statues. No, they're not dismembered heads. They're statues reminding him constantly of his duty to the Republic, of his duty to show self-restraint. Yeah, he might be an aristocrat and he might be very wealthy, but don't flaunt it. Be humble. Value your freedom and your honor above all else, especially in the eyes of the common plebeians. The plebeians, likewise, well, they're obviously the democracy. That's fine, right? But don't behave like a mob, plebeians. And if we can just both conduct ourselves in that way and follow the laws together and obey the laws equally of Rome, then we will have an ability to bring together the Senate and the people both. This was enshrined in the 12 tablets, these stone tablets early on in the Republic that would be publicly displayed and everyone could refer to them and look at them. And they had this profound authority to them. Speaking of authority, it's like seeing Moses' 10 Commandments. You just think you ought to obey just by glancing at them. They had that sort of gravity to them. So too it was for the Romans. There it is, gravitas, once again. Because of the deal, the sort of careful balance between the plebes and patricians, we had what was called the name of the Roman government, the Senate and the people together, SPQR. If you want to get fancy in Latin, Senatus et Populus Romanum, a beautiful sound to it. It basically was like the USA, the United States of America. But unlike us, when the Romans said it, they didn't mean a collection of sovereign states banding together under a constitution. What they meant was those two classes of people, the upper and the lower classes, finding common interest in preserving the republic and submitting themselves to law. And it was an amazing achievement. While Greek cities are just tearing themselves apart, democratic mobs turn to tyrants, tyrants get overthrown by aristocracies, and around it goes, Rome was stable. And so a certain Greek marveled at this fact and thought very carefully about what a republic was. Polybius. To get at Polybius's point, let's consider kind of a diagram of the regimes We've been using that word. What is a regime? Well, first of all, it's not the same thing as a government. We use those terms interchangeably, and indeed, you'll see the textbooks say that, but ignore that. A regime is the way a city is organized, a polis, or the Roman word was a civitas. We get the word city. We also get the word civilization. But if you think about it, there are two basic kinds of cities. I'm using my doodle pad here, so bear with me. What is the most basic kind, or the two most basic kinds? I'm gonna, if it'll work here, come on. Is it working? It worked when I tested it. Well, come on. I was all ready to do this. I'm gonna use my mouse pad. That's right. Draw a line. There are two kinds, and it's those who rule in their own interest. And I'm doing this with my mouse. Bear with me. This looks terrible. I'll just say own. And those who rule for the sake of the whole interest. Everybody, themselves as well as everyone else. It's okay to rule in your own interest, but it's more of a problem when you only rule in your own interest. No, so much more meaningful to rule in the interest of the whole. Now, Polybius did this, Aristotle did it, practically every ancient philosopher who thought about these things at all would always do the regime analysis. I'm going to draw these on a slant, and you'll see why here in a second. Who rules in their own interest? Or first of all, what are the three basic divisions? Well, first of all, you got the one ruler, you've got the few, and you've got the, what's that leave? How about the many, the multitude, or the majority? All right. Many, there you go. The one, the few, and the many. All right. Who is the one who rules in their own interest? That's the tyrant. I'm just going to abbreviate here, TYR, the tyrant. And they're out for power. They're out for preserving their power. All right. Who is the one who rules in the interest of the whole? We've mentioned it a few times. Well, that's a king. That's a monarchy. Now, I draw these on a slant because they tend to have things in common. A king could potentially become a tyrant, although as Plato showed, it's much more common to see a democracy give rise to a tyrant. But kings can be pretty bad. Kings are similar to tyrants because they are concerned with power the same way a tyrant is, but they're more concerned with tradition. Sorry, I meant to underline these. There you go. All right, moving up the scale. What is the few who rules in the interest of themselves? Plato mentioned them. It's where what a democracy emerges out of. That's an oligarch. OLIG. I'm going to abbreviate it. That's OLIG for oligarch. Who are the few who rules in the interest of the whole and not just themselves? That's a really interesting group that we haven't quite mentioned yet. It's what the patricians were in Rome. The Greek word was aristoi, and it meant the best, the aristocracy. Think dukes and lords in castles. Think the nobles. I'm going to say aristoi, but yeah, aristocracy. We tend to use the word aristocracy to describe the rich. It's not the same though, because the rich, they rule just for the sake of their money. They're able to hire mercenary soldiers and all that kind of thing. No, a true aristocracy does not rule for money. They might be the rich, but that's not the point. They rule for the sake of honor, nobility. They're very often distinguished by family names, kind of like the way the king is, only they're large groups of people while the king is like one at a time. So what's that leave? The rule of the many in their own interest. We've met it before. That's democracy. Plato would say, yep, that's exactly what it is. It's a mob, right? They start off with this noble idea of equality and freedom. They love freedom, but pretty quick, what happens to them? They drift down the slope into mob mentality, and then eventually they become a tyranny. What is the rule of the many in the interest of the whole? So in other words, majority rule as democracy has it, but with respect to the minority. Well, the Greek word was a polity. That's what Plato's book was really called, like I mentioned a minute ago. This is really hard with the mouse, sorry. Polity, although it looks better than I expected. We know it by its Latin name, its Roman name, a res publica, a thing of the people. What distinguishes each of these regimes? Well, first of all, what do all these have in common? It is, in every case, some people, or maybe one person, ruling over other people. It's people over people, ruling, absolutely. What's different about a polity or a republic? I'll put a republic here just so you know. Well, that's a regime where law rules, legere, right? Lex in Latin. Because the rule of law is rational and cold. It's aware of people's passions, but in each one of these regimes, the passions really govern, don't they? The passion for honor, the passion for power, the passion for tradition and the king, the passion for money, greed, right? The passion for equality in a democracy. No, but what's different about these regimes is that there are no passions ruling. The passions are there, yeah, but law governs the passions. The other thing that distinguishes a republic is the fact that law shapes offices, officium, back to that, officia, plural, that are filled by people. We don't have rulers in a republic. We have governors. We have office holders. They're put there by votes, and they can be removed from office. They have a term of office. And that's a whole different kind of regime. Now, here's the thing. I drew these on a slope to emphasize that every one of these regimes can potentially slip down the slope. Within every aristocracy is a potential oligarchy. Within every monarchy is a potential tyrant, though it's not as likely as these are. So too, within every republic, as Plato said, you can slip down the slope and become a democracy. Although his Athens never really was a republic, it started a democracy. But still, where's that safety net? I kind of put it that way in my question, right? Where's that thing that prevents the republic from becoming a democracy? Well, that's what Polybius was fascinated by when he looked at the Roman Republic. He lived at a time when Rome was starting to expand. Why? Conquest and glory? Some Romans might have seen it that way, but more often it was national security. What do you do about your enemies, especially those that could potentially reorganize and conquer you again in the future, like Carthage, like various kingdoms around Greece? There were threats everywhere for the Romans. So what do? You can't just defeat them and then go home. You have to occupy their land. You can't just regime change, although they did do that later. I think, King Herod in Judea. But more than that, you got to stay there and occupy. So really, the Roman Empire was becoming an empire by accident. There was really nothing in early Rome that indicated Romans wanted this. Still, though, the lands that they did occupy, they did something very extraordinary, and it had been a practice since clear back in the early days of Roman history. They would grant citizenship to the people they conquered. Not everybody wanted it, but if they did, they could have it, and Romans were fine with that. So even though they came from very old Italian stock, there was an understanding that anybody could become a citizen if they just understood the laws, if they knew how to order their lives in a way that they could sort of imitate Romans. So everybody's welcome. It's a big, diverse empire. And at this time, it was still pretty small compared to what it would be later. But Polybius was a Greek who was absorbed into that empire. He lived in a Greek colony city in Italy, and most of the Greeks really resented this. They kind of didn't like, they thought the Romans were kind of arrogant and obnoxious, but Polybius thought they were wonderful because of political theory. As he took a hard look at Roman government, he realized something, that the Romans had found a way to avoid all the trouble that the Greeks had in their cities. They had sidestepped, they had overcome, you might say, what Plato described about democracy and republic. How? He says it right up front, page 8. The three kinds of regimes, monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy, like we saw on that chart, were found united in the Commonwealth of Rome. So they took those three types of regimes, two of them good, monarchy and aristocracy, one of them bad, democracy, right, but inevitable, and they pulled them all together into the Roman Constitution. How do they do this? Did a bunch of founders sit down and draft a constitution for Rome and have the states ratify it? No, that's our constitution. It developed organically. It developed through a long system of trial and error. They blended these things over time. Every time one office seemed to be a little problematic, they would set up another office to counter it. And back and forth it would go. What were those offices? These are some slides from another class. I can't seem to delete the spelling correct, so just ignore that. But the offices were the cursus honorum, or in Latin, the path of honor. A beautiful name, right? For the course of offices. But yeah, it's an honorable course. Suppose you want to get involved in Roman politics. Well, let's follow the career of a young Roman politician, aspiring. Maybe his dad was in office at some point. They had such rapid turnover in office, there was practically always an office available if you really wanted to run. Well, where do you start? What's boot camp for Roman politics? Think Zacchaeus in the Bible, right? You start off a quaestor. The nice term was, a financial manager. What it really meant was a tax collector. And how did the Romans collect taxes? You went door to door and asked nicely. Based on the assessment of your property, you owe this much to the Republic. And did the private citizen, were they obligated to give you the money? Well, if they felt a sense of patriotism, sure. But if they didn't, well, they'd slam the door in your face. What do? Knock on the door again. And you go through rough neighborhoods. And you have a rough time trying to get money out of your fellow citizens because they don't want to pay. By the way, in your notes, give yourself some room. Start at the bottom of the page. So quaestors would very often return to the forum, with the money that they got. You return, and you realize that you've been beaten up pretty bad by various Roman citizens. But if you could handle it, if you could collect the required amount or close to it, if you could stand your ground and persuade your fellow citizens to give you money for the government as you stand there in your pure white toga, maybe you could hack it in Roman politics. If you couldn't, well, go do something else. Join the military, perhaps. That'd be easier. That's kind of how they looked at it. Next came what the aediles, as they were called, and they were more like the budget spending. So if the quaestors brought the money in, the aediles sent the money out. And they would manage public works, their most important duty, festivals, sacrificial animals to the gods. Romans took religion very seriously. If you could hack it as an aedile, some would stay within these offices for years. Others would apply and run for office again. As a praetor held what was called the imperium, the legal authority to command based on dictates of higher offices. In practice, they were usually the ones in charge of legal procedures and judicial duties. Roman courts of law were very strict about the way that they would approach criminal prosecution and defense and examination and cross-examination, very similar to the way we think of law today. We inherit a great deal of that practice from the Romans. Some people would stay praetors throughout their political careers and then retire, become very famous, defense attorneys. And turns out Marcus Tullius Cicero actually was a praetor for quite some time. He was quite good at it, and he would get many people acquitted of crimes in court. But others would climb the ladder, go up the path of honor, and then they would make their way to the consulship. This was the highest elected office and it was the chief executive, but it was not as glorious as the presidency because you always had to share it with someone else, right? Not very satisfying if you've got overbearing ambition. I have to share it and a one-year term of office without the possibility of re-election. All throughout the Roman Republic's history, there were only a couple times where a consul was re-elected. Gaius Marius was re-elected 7 times, only because there was an extended war with the Germanic tribes, and he seemed to be the only consul capable of holding Rome together through that. But otherwise, 1 year, that's it. And then you're expected to just step down and go back to private life or maybe run for one of the lower offices. Still, though, it'd be kind of pretty painful to climb the ladder and then find out you just got to, quit. There was one other office that was quite different. Not elected. Senators were admitted. The Senate would decide whether or not you were worthy. Initially, the Senate was the nobles, the patricians. But over time, plebeians began to be admitted based on their character and their sense of honor and how well they had executed their duties in lower offices. And they'd be admitted on the basis of personal merit and a sense of reputation and virtue. And they could be what was called a new man in Rome, meaning somebody who came from humble background of plebeian stock and made their way all the way up to either the consul or the senator. Then you have the dictator. And again, sorry, I can't turn off the spell check here. Ignore the lines. But the dictator is a temporary commander in chief. So a consul can certainly manage wartime affairs, but they tended to be more about domestic affairs. The dictator would be called up for a specific period of time. The Senate would basically suspend all the laws of Rome and say that they are now embodied in this person. There were also the lictors. They're like bodyguards for all public officials. You know a lictor by the fasces, these big awkward axes that they would carry, but they were not really meant for fighting with. They were more symbols of authority, auctoritas, right? And they were big, tough guys who would be like the bodyguards for public officials. You had the tribune. Look at the Senate on one hand, and then look at the ordinary elected official in the assembly, which we haven't gotten to on the other. The assembly member, though, was just an ordinary citizen who'd be spontaneously chosen by his fellow citizens to represent them. And then he'd step down. He'd basically hold office for a day, whereas the senators were there for life. They were there for good. The tribune was entrusted with mediating between the Senate and the assembly. Tribunes were always surrounded by lictors. Tribunes always wore togas with a purple lining. You can see on this guy, purple lining at the end of his toga. And wherever the tribunes went on official business, there would be prayers and sacrifices along the way. Always prayers and sacrifices to the gods. Last of all, you had the censor, a 7-year term, the only one of its kind. And it was always entrusted with regulating public morals. Imagine that. A guy who comes around and makes sure that you're not indulging in too much luxury in your private home? How dare he? Well, the Romans thought it was necessary for self-restraint and freedom. These were the terms of the SPQR, remember? These were the things that made sure that Romans always stayed worthy of their liberty. 7-year terms, and they could run again and again if they were a good censor. That's, of course, where we get the word censorship. Bunch of offices here, but Polybius focuses on 3 in particular that have this very interesting way of allowing for all the impulses of other regimes to find an outlet, but in doing so, make sure that they limit the power of the government over the lives of Roman citizens, to make sure that they seek justice and the common good. Yeah, they'll make mistakes, but at least we can bring out the best in people. It was indeed a very, very basic type of checks and balances. Not as sophisticated as the American Constitution, as we'll see, but wow, quite an invention. Monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. You find all these things, like we just said, in the Roman Constitution. Well, first of all, you got the consuls, the 2 consuls, remember, elected on an annual basis. And what can they do? They're the masters of all public affairs. They propose measures for debate in the Senate. And sometimes bills. They can submit a bill, a piece of possible legislation for the Senate to debate, but then of course it must go to the assembly to be ratified for it to become a law. What else could they do? They could call together emergency assembly meetings, not the Senate. The Senate always does its own thing, but the assembly could be called together for some kind of emergency. They could also propose resolutions specifically to the Senate that only affected the Roman government itself, not so much society. And they could ratify, they could basically agree to things. And Polybius doesn't say it here, but by implication, if they could ratify, what else could they do? Veto. They could veto. And what's interesting too is that consuls could actually veto each other. If one consul did something the other one didn't like, veto. He'd say it publicly, and under law, the other consul would comply. Imagine what this is like, though. You've been up all night working on a bill, and you've poured your heart into it for the good of Rome, and you get up and start to read it out loud. Romans read everything out loud. And some guy across the assembly yells out, veto. Do you say, hey, I worked so hard on this. How dare you? No. You say, what are your objections? Write them down, and you go back to square one. The consuls could do this. Other members of the assembly could do this. Senators would do this to each other. So the veto power, what really was kind of the linchpin of the whole system of checks and balances. So too were those sacred tribunes that would mediate between the people and the aristocracy, between the plebes and the patricians. The sanctity of that person, the sanctity of the person of the tribune is a very common phrase. So those are the consuls. But what about the Senate? Like we said, senators were admitted, they were not elected. They would be sort of invited almost into an elite club. They managed the public money, not the consuls. The consuls could propose, tax bills. The consuls could propose spending, but they could not tax. They could not spend. No, that's the Senate's business. Most of what they would appropriate would be for repairing public edifices, like temples to the gods. Not so much for war, which is quite interesting. The Romans would spend a lot on war, but most of the time it was sort of expected that private citizens would just sort of step up and do it. By the time of the empire, it was different. It was publicly funded. That was all different. But they could also report. They could also consult with the senators, or sorry, with the consuls, or censors. I mean, sorry, censors. I meant to say, the censors had an unusual power. They could remove a consul. If a consul was badly behaved, the censor could kick him out, just like that, no questions asked. So yeah, censors were a really peculiar office in that way. But otherwise, consuls had tremendous power. They had the cognizance of all crimes. They could sort of define crimes and what was a crime and what was not, which seems very strange. But the Romans didn't really have a criminal code of law as we think of it. Law was more of a tradition. And so they were expected to base their judgments on tradition. They could also conduct, the Senate could, I mean, they could conduct a public examination and inquiry. So much like the way our Congress can investigate with a special committee or a special prosecutor, right? We've seen that, a lot in the last couple of years. The Senate too was able to conduct those kinds of investigations, and then expect that the praetors would deal with the actual criminal prosecution, very much like Congress defers to the Justice Department in our system. They could practice the denunciation of war, like the end of a war. The Senate could receive ambassadors. That's really interesting. Who does that in our system? Only the president. No, but in Rome, yeah, senators would receive foreign ambassadors to talk. So all that to say, the consuls and the Senate were basically non-democratic institutions, according to Polybius. The people have no share in the functioning of these things. They vote for the consuls, but that's it. Once the consuls are in office, they're there, and the only way they can be removed is by a censor. People have no share in this, he says on page 9. To those, therefore, who come to reside in Rome during the absence of the consuls, the government appears to be purely aristocratic, right? Many of the Greeks, especially, and of the foreign princes, are easily led into this persuasion when they perceive that almost all the affairs which they are forced to negotiate with the Romans are determined by the Senate. So yeah, the Senate, completely insulated from the Roman people. So we'll compare that to our Senate later. It's quite a fascinating contrast. So consuls, Senate, the assembly, kind of touched on that already. Members of the assembly were not office holders. They were just ordinary Romans who showed up. When they voted, they would vote in block. So they would sort of break up into groups, right? Like in elementary school, and then they would choose their spokesman. And he would be the one to sort of represent the interests of his group. And some members of the assembly would be very persuasive and interesting speakers. They would draft bills. They would veto. But again, they weren't doing this because they held office, or if they did, it was only for a day. And then as soon as the assembly adjourned, they'd go home and just be private citizens. The assembly had considerable power, though. They could distribute rewards and punishments, which is remarkable. And that's similar to the Athenian assembly that convicted Socrates in that way. They could sentence people to die, which is striking. However, if someone was condemned, and if the assembly let them, they could come in and plead for their life and negotiate an exile. And it would be up to the assembly, through a vote, to decide whether or not to grant it. Voluntary banishment was the option. If you're banished, you're never coming back unless something drastic happens in Rome. They could also give the noblest rewards. Far more, not the Senate, not the consuls, but the assembly could bestow honors on people and recognize their nobility. One of the most important ceremonies they would perform was the triumphal procession, when a great general returned from battle victorious. A huge parade and people cheering and the general's face painted red in a solemn procession all the way to the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, who is Jupiter the god, better known as Zeus. That would be the careful arrangement of the assembly. They would grant triumphs. To refuse a triumph to some general or military figure was a serious insult. Never, never do that unless you're looking for trouble. But they usually granted them. They would make treaties. They would declare war. Purely their prerogative. So while the Senate would finish a war, it was the assembly that would initiate it. So crazy, complicated mess of a system. It's really nothing quite like the American system, which is a lot more sophisticated, but at the same time, a lot clearer. The Roman Constitution was just all over the place. Why was it so messy? Well, because it had taken shape this way through a long decades of trial and error. And Polybius was quite sure that the secret to Roman freedom really did seem to lie in these institutions. The assembly was very democratic, and yet it was democracy that had been trained and restrained in such a way that it behaved its best. Very different from Greek assemblies that he would have known. Remember, Polybius was a Greek. And he was just amazed at the way that the Roman assembly could conduct itself in a way that was very orderly and calm. Yeah, tempers would flare here and there, and it always seemed a little bit volatile. But in the end, everyone followed procedures. And as a result, Romans tended to produce more just and reasonable public policy than Greek cities could. They didn't act on whims. They didn't explode with mob violence quite the way that Greek cities did. That's worth admiring. And yet, there's a big missing piece here. Even though he says at the end, see on page 9 for the end of the read, that thus, while each of these separate parts is enabled either to assist or obstruct the rest, the government, by the apt contexture of them all, interacting these three parts, I wouldn't say branches of government, but they're more like divisions of offices. The contexture of them all in the general frame is so well secured against every accident that it seems scarcely possible to invent a more perfect system. So he was really fascinated and just enraptured with the beauty of this system. And yet, what's the missing piece here? What does all of this assume about Romans themselves? Did he mention tradition? Did he mention virtue? That's another Roman word, by the way, virtus. I didn't put it on that list, but did he mention the kind of people Romans are? He didn't seem to think that those things really mattered. Those were valuable in war. Those were valuable in, the way you raised your kids. Yeah. But as far as government went, as far as how Rome kept itself from slipping down that slope from republic to democracy, he didn't really seem to think that character related to that at all. What does it? I mean, suppose the Romans were completely vicious and self-serving. Would the system work just as well? Polybius doesn't say it in so many words, but he seems to think yes. It is one thing to talk about governing ourselves and being free because government limits itself and allows us to be free. And that's very important. That's certainly what Polybius understood about the Roman system. But again, the missing piece is the kind of government of yourself. Can a people enjoy political freedom who do not have personal freedom? Well, personal freedom from what? What is the cruelest and most oppressive tyrant you can possibly have? Well, it's yourself, right? It's your own passions. It's your own desires that can overwhelm you, right? There's a little Saddam Hussein in all of us. We are all our own worst tyrants, are we not? How do you become free from that? Well, virtue was the way. Virtus, like we said, is a Roman word, Latin word. The word vir, the V had a W pronunciation, but the word vir is a man. So virtus is the purpose of a man. Virtue, that's basically what it means. Of course, the Romans, when they said men, they meant men instead of women. However, it's pretty clear that women can have these qualities too in their own way, and in their own, very unique way. They're often depicted as maidens, though. What were they? Well, there's the first you've got to learn, moderation. There she is. pouring a glass of wine or something. Not too little, not too much, just the right amount. Unless, of course, it's New Year's Eve, right? Or maybe it's Lent. You diminish or you increase depending on the circumstances. But in general, you find moderation. It's not that the pleasure is bad. No, it's that the excess of the pleasure is bad. And so too is the deficiency. Second, you have courage, a little out of order here, but you see her there with the helmet on, ready to face mortal fear and inspire in mortal men their courage, the ability to stand their ground. What is courage? Is it just wild, reckless run into battle? No, it's somewhere between being a coward, running away, and being reckless. Somewhere in between is that steady, bold kind of courage. True courage is not found in attack or retreat, but in endurance. Think of the Greek hoplite in the army, right? Holding that big shield and sword in the other hand and fighting in formation, always in a tight formation. Romans, much the same idea. It's very easy to understand what courage is, to stare down mortal fear. And you notice how these kind of mark the growth of a person, right? Moderation is what children have to learn. Courage is more like what teenagers have to learn. Of course, with teenage boys, they have to, learn a little less recklessness, right? Well, then they discover courage, right? Justice, that's when you're kind of in charge of large groups of people, right? You see justice there holding a sword in one hand and a scales in the other, determining what is fair and then executing it. And at the top, staring into the mirror because she is an image of self-knowledge, wisdom or prudence. What does prudence mean? Does it mean being a prude? No, it means a kind of wisdom that has to do with seeing, just kind of habitually knowing the right thing to do at the right time for the right reason in the right way. And each of these is a habit. Each of them, or at least the first three, are sort of a mean between two extremes. So moderation is between indulgence on one hand and total abstinence on the other. Courage is a mean between cowardice on one hand and recklessness on the other. Justice is a mean between two extremes of equality. Everyone's absolutely equal, like democracy, the way that Plato described it, or maybe everyone's radically unequal, like in a radical aristocracy. Justice is somewhere between those. It's giving people what they deserve, right? Prudence is different. Can you ever have too much prudence? Is there ever an excess of it? Yeah, you can be, too knowledgeable. You can be erudite and smarmy, but no, as far as just knowing the right thing to do at the right time for the right reason, yeah, prudence is it, and you can never have too much of it. Oh, I wish I had more, but yeah, these are the virtues that make a person free. And so, as brilliant as Polybius was in offering his insights on Roman government, there were those who would disagree and point out that, hey, we really are free as Romans, and other people are invited to be free Romans because they have the virtues. That's the kind of person that is worthy of the rule of law. Marcus Tullius Cicero had an incredible double life, living at the tail end of the Roman Republic, and of course, finally seeing it collapse. He was, on one hand, contemplative. He would retreat to his villa and read and read and read. And he read Plato. He loved the writings of Plato. They deeply shaped his outlook on things. But then he would run for office, and he would face the Roman Forum and the crowd and the noise and the attention and the stress and the danger. What kind of person can live both of these lives? That's a rare thing. If you're a contemplative like myself, you never want to run for office. I can't imagine running for office. It just sounds terrifying. It would disrupt me from my quiet contemplative life with my books. At the same time, if you're a politician, you ever think of slowing down and reading something thoughtful and insightful? No, you're trying to get yourself reelected. You're trying to make yourself popular with the people. You're trying to, advance your agenda with your party. You're trying, Cicero did it both. How in the world did he pull this off? It truly made him a model of statesmanship for centuries to come, and many figures are likened to him for this reason. What did he have to say, though, about the Republic? As you look on page 10 at his snippet from his book, The Republic. So we had Plato's Republic, which again, remember in Greek is the polity, When Cicero said the Republic, he was using his own Latin language. It was a res publica. It's an obscure text that was actually missing for centuries. Classicists, historians knew it existed and always wanted to get their hands on it, but it just seemed like it was gone. They would see it quoted and they'd find fragments of it in all kinds of other texts, especially St. Augustine. But then there was a big breakthrough in the late 19th century. Somebody was searching around in the archives in the Vatican, and they found a copy, an original copy of St. Augustine's Commentary on the Psalms, a wonderful book. But they noticed something unusual about the paper under the papyrus. There was writing underneath Augustine's writing. He had basically erased the pages of another book to write his commentary on the Psalms. And using special lighting and equipment, all of a sudden it was discovered. Cicero's Republic. Augustine had basically ripped pages out of Cicero to write his commentary. Now we had it. You can tell it's damaged because there are a lot of brackets, like at the very beginning. But we get a pretty good idea of what Cicero had to say at the beginning of his defense of the Republic and how he defends it. Without active patriotism, they could never have delivered our native land from attack. Who's they? We don't know. The text is damaged, but presumably famous Romans like others he mentions, Gaius Duilius, Aulus Atilius. It's okay if you don't know who these names are, Google them if you like, but they're really just a bunch of famous Romans who stepped up and saved Rome from profound and devastating crises, a whole bunch of them. The Scipios in particular, who we'll come back to, were the ones who finished off Rome's mortal enemy, father and son, Scipio Africanus, defeated Carthage in the Third Punic War. It was like World War II for Rome. It was the greatest generation. We'll get back to him. There's also Marcus Cato, again, unknown and of obscure birth, by whom, as by pattern, as by emulation, all of us who are devoted to the same pursuits are drawn to diligence and valor. We might surely have remained at Tusculum in the enjoyment of the leisurely life, of the healthful sport so near to Rome. We all wish for private life, sitting in that quiet room, talking with friends, soaking in the baths, all the things that Romans did. But no, he, a madman as our friends maintain, preferred, though no necessity constrained him, to be tossed by the billows and storms of public life, of politics, even to an extent of old age, rather than to live a life of complete happiness and calm and ease in such retirement. How do you get someone who is good? And the good men always prefer private life, don't they? How do you get the good man to enter politics when politics is so messy and vicious, knowing full well that he could get trampled, and in some cases he could be assassinated if he's not careful? Why in the world would a good man ever do that? Well, it turns out Rome invites them to do it. Consider Socrates in Athens. He never held public office. He would, show up for the assembly and he'd be sort of involved as an ordinary citizen. He'd vote, but that was it. Because but ultimately the democracy of Athens didn't invite men like him. Cicero says, but Rome does. Rome wants the best people to hold office. The point is, nature has implanted in the human race so great a need of virtue, there it is, the four cardinal virtues, and so great a desire to defend the common safety and strength thereof, that has conquered all the allurements of pleasure and ease. What do we want so much more than pleasure and ease? We want honor. Of course, you probably look at yourself and say, no, I don't. Pleasure and ease sounds great. Well, I'm inclined to agree with you. However, Cicero's point is, if you understand what the Republic is, and if you understand all those who came before you who didn't just settle for pleasure and ease, but served, you feel the call too. It is not enough, he says, to possess virtue just all by itself, as if it were an art of some sort, unless you make use of it. Though it is true that an art, even if you never use it, can still remain in your possession by the very fact of your knowledge of it, yet the existence of virtue depends entirely upon its use. And its noblest use is in the government of the state, or the city, it's a mistranslation, but yeah, political life. And the realization, in fact, not in words, of those very things that the philosophers in their corners are continually dining in our ears. Aren't the philosophers the best ones, telling us that we ought to be virtuous and do the right thing? That's fine if you're just talking about ordinary life in a democracy, in a monarchy, whatever. But if the philosophers tell you that in a republic, it means something very specific. Don't just live a good life yourself, but bring it to the public forum. It's dangerous, it's noisy, and it can corrupt you, but the republic calls to you. There is no principle enunciated by the philosophers, he says, top of page 10, at least none that is just and honorable, that has not been discovered and established by those who have drawn up codes of law for states. Isn't this what lawgivers assume about their people? He gives a whole bunch of examples, and we don't have to go through them. Some of them are Greek. But still, there are those who would disagree with Cicero, wouldn't they? Consider Miltiades, defended Athens from the first Persian invasion in 490 BC, when Emperor Darius sent the order to attack Greece for the first time. The second time was Xerxes. And he saved Greece. He saved Athens. And then he was exiled on suspicion of plotting some kind of conspiracy against the people of Athens. Why would you mess with politics when you get treated that way? Consider Themistocles, also savior of Athens against the second Persian invasion, when he fought off Xerxes' navy off the coast of Athens and succeeded by a brilliant strategy of harnessing the winds that blow off the Mediterranean from the opposite direction. And this defeated this vastly bigger naval fleet. And what happened to Themistocles? Athens' most eminent citizen, he too was exiled from the city. I know, Cicero says. Democracy treats its best citizens badly. And indeed, we Romans have been guilty too. Many have been exiled because of their, despite their good deeds for Rome, sad to say. Remember, the assembly was in charge of exile. But not as many have been kicked out as have been kept and treasured by the Roman people for their good deeds and their virtue. Indeed, those who've been kicked out include Cicero himself. He did a lot of his best writing while he was in exile. And what's funny is others would just be heartbroken to be exiled. In Cicero's mind, he thought, great, I get to go read my books again and live that quiet life of leisure. And sure enough, whatever the problem was would blow over and he'd be invited back. He'd run for office again. So that's the idea, though, that the free man isn't somebody who just has rights, who doesn't just live under a free self-governing system. No, the truly free man is free in his heart. Just like Livy said at the beginning. Remember that quote? Real freedom begins in the heart. Cicero would have wholeheartedly agreed. For in truth, he said, page 11, second to last paragraph, that first column. In truth, our country has not given birth and education without expecting to receive some sustenance, as it were, from us in return. Consider all your rights. Consider all the freedom that you enjoy every day. Why do you have that? Did they just fall out of the sky? Is it just because they were written on a piece of paper, like a Bill of Rights? No, it's because your ancestors wanted to give it to you. Maybe you owe them something. Maybe you owe them responsible citizenship, Cicero would say. Nor has our country been merely to serve our convenience in our private life, that she has granted our leisure a safe refuge and for our moments of repose and calm retreat. On the contrary, Rome has given us these advantages so that she may appropriate to her own use the greater and more important part of our courage, there it is, talents, wisdom, that's prudence, leaving to us for our own private uses only so much as may be left after her needs have been satisfied. So yeah, serve in public life, be ready to retire when the time comes, but know that you owe it to the Republic to step up and serve in its offices and show up in the forum and care and stay informed and educate your children the right way. What an amazing call he gives to step up to responsible citizenship. This call especially goes out to those who could be extraordinary leaders. He's aware that most people, just they will vote, they will care, they will be good citizens, they'll raise their kids well. But what about the noble types, the ambitious types? He says in the last paragraph, why do they only show up when there's a crisis? What if the good men could govern when there isn't a crisis in a way that might prevent a crisis? Why is it only when the sea is calm that we see sleazy politicians? It's only when the storm comes up that the good man jumps up and grabs the steering wheel of the ship. Great question. He transitions to a dream he claims to have had, the dream of Scipio. Scipio Africanus lived some time before Cicero's time in the early Republic. He was the one who we mentioned a minute ago who defeated Carthage in the Third Punic War and razed the city to the ground and planned to have Romans occupy it. He was a truly profound Roman hero. Cicero tells this story, though, about his dream, speaking as Scipio. So he's pretending to be Scipio here. And this is a popular legend in Rome. But he says, when I arrived in Africa, where I once was, as you were aware, military tribune for the 4th Legion under the consul of Manlius. The consulships, right? They go year by year. One of them was named Manlius. There was nothing of which I was more earnestly desirous than to see the king of Massinissa, king of that area, who, for just a few reasons, had been always a special friend of our family. So not a Carthaginian king, he's another king. But as he was visiting there, he fell asleep. And what did he see? He drifted up into the heavens. And there he saw the spheres. In classical cosmology and well into the Middle Ages, as you might know, there weren't, planets and solar systems and galaxies as we think of it. The whole universe was basically one massive globe, and the spheres would rotate, and on those spheres were the planets. So that we get them mixed up. The spheres weren't the planets themselves, but as they rotated, they generated this beautiful, beautiful music. Wow, I've never heard anything like this, Scipio says. Why have I not noticed this before? And then he meets one of his ancestors, and they hug each other, and his ancestor shows him the cosmos and the spheres and the music. You haven't heard it before, he says, because you're so busy down there on Earth. And Scipio looks down, and what does he see but this little ball? There's Earth. And on it is this little speck that he recognizes. It's the Mediterranean. It's the Roman Empire surrounding it, at least as it was at this time. Very small still. But wow, what a tiny and minuscule thing it is, in contrast to the cosmos. And yet, Scipio notices he can't stop looking down at this little empire, this little patch of land. The point here is, of course, that Cicero means to say that there is a certain kinship between the cosmos and the political order. Some are better than others. Democracy is sort of remote, tyranny is remotest of all, but a republic has a certain kinship, a certain likeness to the cosmos. In that, Cicero seems to say, through Scipio, he's sort of speaking through Scipio here, that the responsible citizen is somebody who tries as best they can, whether in their own humble way, just voting and staying informed and educating their kids, or running for office. But in whatever way, they try as best they can to shape the political order around them and the souls of the people who they're entrusted with governing according to the order of the cosmos. This was captured in a very important architectural feat of the Romans that disappeared for some time and then came back in the Renaissance, and you're familiar with it today, I'm sure. The dome structure, meant to be, like Hadrian's Pantheon, a model of the cosmos, that our political order down here is meant to imitate the heavenly order up there. And our Capitol dome, you notice it on the cover of the banner of the class on Canvas, as well as the readings packet. I love that image of the statue looking up at it. That too is meant to be this order of the cosmos reflected down here. You've ever been in Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C.? You look up at that rotunda and it's just so awe-inspiring and beautiful. And it should, as it should be. And it really is an extraordinary public space. But its intention behind it really was kind of derived from Scipio's dream that the relationship between the cosmos and the political order actually matters. So, did you ever think about politics that way? Well, Cicero was making this argument, remember, at a time when the Roman Republic was in its twilight, and you can really sense it in the way that he's writing. It's getting rough, it's getting messy. And of course, we had seen the rise of Gaius Julius Caesar, who would become the guy who finished off the Republic and ushered in the empire. It's not clear that that's what Caesar actually meant to do. He just didn't really like the fact that the consulship was a year long and he had to share it with somebody else. He served his time as consul and then he stepped down. And then he requested that he be governor of Gaul up in the woods. And he seemed to be a truly seedy and ambitious politician. Cicero always had him figured out. Cicero was much, much wiser than that. But wow, Caesar just seemed unstoppable. He was so popular with the people. He proposed radical measures to change the Roman constitution, but nobody listened. So everyone was relieved when he asked to be relocated to Gaul. Nobody wants to be governor of Gaul. It's a bunch of woods and savage tribes up there. Get him out of here. Little did they know that Caesar would go up there, raise up a contingent of Roman troops who were stationed there, and prepare them for revolution. He would march south and cross the Rubicon River and march on Rome. And it turned out to be a very benevolent move on his part. Again, he didn't mean to destroy the Republic. He just wanted to satisfy his ambition. And so he did, and had himself declared dictator because of a crisis which he himself created. But still, he was a kind dictator. He reached out to all of his political enemies. He tried to reassure everyone that the Republic will endure. I just want to make some changes in the name, of course, of the people, the people, the people, just like Plato said. The tyrant does not start off a cruel, vicious, bloodthirsty kind of guy. He starts off everybody's pal, except for the elites. But still, Caesar did try to reach out to the elites. And in fact, he tried to reach out to Cicero. The fateful day came, the Ides of March, despite the warnings of a seer, a mystic in the street. Beware the Ides of March, Julius Caesar, he said every day. And finally, the Ides of March came, the 4th of March came. And Julius Caesar walked over to the old man and said, "It's here, sir, and I'm still alive." "Ah, but the day is not over, Julius Caesar." "Ah, whatever." He went to the forum and sat down for what he thought would be official business with the Senate. And out came the daggers, and Caesar was assassinated on the floor of the Roman Senate. The conspiracy had been organized by Brutus. Remember, Brutus, you might recall, was also the one who cast out the Tarquins back at the founding of Rome. This was another Brutus, Brutus the Younger, and kind of inherited that name and believed he was a descendant. He and several other senators coordinated to get rid of this guy and save the Republic. Was Cicero involved in this conspiracy? He was not. In fact, the conspirators planned very carefully to make sure that Cicero knew nothing about it and would never be involved. And as the body of Caesar lay bleeding on the floor and the senators covered in his blood all over their white togas, they turned to Cicero, who was there, and congratulated him on saving the Republic. "I didn't do this," Cicero said. "You did." But still, they credited his arguments, his praise of the Republic, what we just read, as their inspiration. This is serious trouble. He immediately retreated from Rome and went into private life, but of course came back and was put on trial as an enemy of the state and killed by Mark Antony, close associate of Julius Caesar. Mark Antony was later overthrown by Caesar Augustus, who became the first emperor, and hence the Roman Empire begins. And just a few years into Caesar Augustus's reign, Jesus Christ was born. Remember the census in the Holy Land called by Emperor Augustus, and young Mary and Joseph set out on their way to report for duty? We'll get to that. Next time, what does Christianity do to the political conversation? Let's backtrack though and talk about a few